Hello everyone, welcome to my class. Myself Janisha from Saint Joseph Composite PU College, Vijaypur. I'm dealing with economics subject. In the previous chapter, you have studied that collection of data. In that, how to collect the data, what are the sources of data, what are the modes of collection of data, methods of data collection, and also census and sample surveys, questionnaire method. So like that, so many aspects you learn in the previous chapter. So major, you studied about the collection of data. Now in this chapter, you're going to study about those collected data, how to be classified, and what is the purpose of classifying the raw data. So these things we are going to discuss from this chapter. And also after studying this chapter, you should enable to know about that. And also after studying this chapter, you should enable following things. First one, you can classify the data for further statistical analysis. You came to know about the differences between or distinguish between quantitative and qualitative classification. That means classification of data, which are the classification of data that you can learn, and also the preparation of frequency distribution table, means how to prepare the frequency distribution, what are the steps need to prepare the frequency distribution so that you can learn, and also be familiar with the method of tally marking, means tally marking method you can learn. And finally you came to know about the differentiate between univariate and bivariate frequency distribution. Along with, you also came to know about that variables, types of variables, next the types of frequency distribution. So these things you can learn from this chapter. Now we'll discuss this chapter regarding the introductory part. As I already mentioned that in the previous chapter, what you learned. So you learned about how data is collected and also came to know about the differences between census and sampling method. Dear students, you just revise in the census method and also in the sample method, and also the two sources like primary sources, secondary sources, and also the modes of collection of data like personal interview, mailing questionnaire method, telephone interview method. So these are what the methods of collecting the data. Now this chapter completely reveals that regarding the how the data that should be collected and are to be classified, because only if we collecting the data it is not sufficient for the statistical analysis. Once we collect the data, definitely we need to make what classification, otherwise it is very difficult to maintain the statistical aspects. So for this purpose, classifying raw data is to bring order in them so that they can be subject to further statistical analysis easily. So this reason we need, or we may, for this reason classification of data, it is required. Now dear students, then let me discuss what is the meaning of organization of data or the classification of data. I said already, organization or the classification of data is a systematic arrangement or organizing the things, that is into groups or classes based on some criteria. So that is called organization of data. That means systematic arrangement of things into groups or classes based on its own criteria or the characteristics. And also the organization of data, which helps to arrange the statistical analysis very easily. Thus we can say that organization of data is a classification of data that is according to its own nature, criteria and the characteristics. Okay students, now let me discuss this with the help of example. Take for example, when you arrange your school books in a certain order, it becomes easier for you to handle them, and you may classify them according to subjects, where each subject becomes a group or a class. That means in your subject, that means in your school books, there are various subjects are there. So for particular books, for particular subject, it should have its own books. So now, if you classify in order way, then it is easily you can choose which books you need immediately or in any emergency. So that when you need a particular book on history, here you just observe the example for history book. See, when you need a particular book on history, for instance, all you need to do is to search that book in the group history. That means easily you can go for history group and you can collect the book. Okay students, now I'll give you another one example. All of you know that local junk dealer or kabadiwala, to whom you sell old newspapers, broken household items, empty glass bottles, plastics, etc. So now he purchases these things from you and he sells them to those who recycle them. Now, as we know that person is what? Junk dealer or the kabadiwala. Now, definitely we can imagine there is a lot of junk things should be there in his shop. Now, here my question is, how he manage his trade properly? Because while he sells these things to recycle, now if all the junks are togetherly available means it's very difficult to manage those things. So now for this purpose he require classification. What classification? How he makes the classification? That is on the basis of its own some criteria as well as the characteristics. Now he can make the groups or he can make the classes, that is on the basis of things into plastic items, glass items, old newspaper or newspaper items. So like that. Now how this junk dealer or the kabadiwala manage these things to recycle purpose? Now he will make separate groups or the classes. According to that groups, he can make groups like plastic things, bottles or metals, newspapers, etc. Now according to this, again further he can make the classifications because to easily. Take for example for metals, in that he can make copper separately, iron separately, brass separately, like that. So now easily he can recognize which items belongs to which category and he can easily sell those things. So for old newspaper, for newspaper section, and also for bottles, that is in separately plastic and plastic section, or it is in metals, in that iron means separately iron, copper means separately copper, like that. So this is very easily he can manage the things in his kabadi wala in his shop. So this is what the organization of data. Thus we can say that organization of data is nothing but the classification of data according to its own criteria, nature and characteristics. And also, what is the use of this classification of data? Dear students, you just think yourself, what is the use of this classification of data? Because while classifying the data or organizing the data, which helps to make our work very easily, and also it is very efficient work, and also third one, it saves our time. Because when we classify the things separate group or separate classes, now directly go through with that part, and it easily we can recognize which things are there in this section or which things you need immediately. So this is what the organization of data. Okay students, now let me discuss about unclassified data or raw data. As you know that the classification of data, then what is unclassified data or raw data? So raw data is nothing but unclassified data only. That means here the data which are not organized way. So these are disorganized things. The raw data of a census, take for example census of India. So you know that the census of India which reveals the population growth of our country. So while the raw data, while we are arranging the census of data, while we classifying the data according to a different groups, now we can easily collect the census according to that groups. That means gender, male, female, education rate, employment rate, occupation or employment rate. So like that, so many things we can make a separate groups. But in the sense, if it is in raw data, that is in the case of census, so then it is, so like that only, the raw data of a census are so large and fragmented that it appears an almost impossible task to draw any meaningful conclusion from them. So that this raw data which creates problem when there is a large number of data if it is available. That is only example census of India. So that census of India, it requires or it consists a large data. So now when we makes the classification, suppose if we are not making the classification or it is in disorganized way, then it is very difficult to identify the things easily. So that raw data which is not suitable when it is the data, it is in too large. So these are what the raw data. Thus we can say that unclassified data is what? Raw data. Okay students. So now these are all the things. Okay students. So these are the simple concepts of this chapter. And in the next session, we'll discuss further more things. Now we'll move on some exercise questions. Question number 1. What is raw data? Question number 2. What is the nature of raw data? Question number 3. What are the uses of classification of data? or the advantages of classification of data. Question number 4. How did Kabadiwala manage his trade, or junk dealer manage his trade by classifying the things? And the last question, number 5th. Write any one demerit of raw data. Okay students, these are the questions you need to write in your book and submit on time. Thank you.